Imagine a city where walls themselves devour babies. In medieval Europe, they called it mercy, a spinning wooden hatch built into church walls where mothers could abandon newborns unseen. Rome's first foundling wheel turned in 1198. Soon Paris, Florence, and Naples followed. The priests called it charity. The accountants called it revenue. Each infant dropped into the wheel fed a vast system of baptisms, wet nurses, and secret burials. For every rescued soul, 10 more vanished into disease, neglect, or profit. What began as salvation became an industry of suffering. Tonight, we open the wheel that ate babies. It looked harmless, a small rotating drum built into the wall of a church or hospital. Turn it once and a baby vanished inside. No questions asked. The first known foundling wheel appeared in medieval Rome under Pope Innocent III, who was horrified by reports of infants dumped in rivers or dung heaps. His solution? Give desperate mothers a way to dispose of their newborns without sin. But mercy always comes with paperwork. Each baby was baptized immediately, renamed, and recorded in thick ledgers like cargo. Priests celebrated every spin of the wheel as a victory for Christ. The problem? Once the door closed, no one ever saw what happened next. Behind the stone wall, a cold hand waited, not always kind, rarely clean, and sometimes paid by the body. Imagine a mother whispering a name, then hearing the wooden wheel creak as her child disappears forever. The church called it salvation. History calls it the beginning of Europe's most efficient child disposal system. And soon, the wheels multiplied, not out of compassion, but profit. Each baby came with a token, a button, a coin, half a rosary, something to prove that one day, if fortune changed, a mother could reclaim her child. In Florence's Spedale degli Innocenti, founded in 1445, scribes carefully sewed these marks of memory into the infant's swaddling. Some are still preserved today, scraps of fabric cut in half like broken hearts. But here's the twist. Most mothers never returned. Those tokens became museum relics of grief. Clergy kept them anyway, cataloged like inventory numbers. They even inspired gambling among nurses who bet which infants would survive the week. The odds weren't good. Up to 90% of foundlings died before age 5. Yet for every tiny corpse, more tokens arrived, spinning in from the alley like prayers no one answered. Modern social workers call this anonymous surrender. In medieval Europe, it was legalized disappearance. A mother's last gesture of love turned into the hospital's receipt, proof that abandonment was now part of God's economy. And when charity meets bureaucracy, you can guess which one wins. Before any milk touched their lips, the infants were baptized, sometimes within minutes of arrival. Salvation had to outrun infection. The priest would sprinkle water, give the baby a new Christian name, and write it into the register. No surname, no lineage. Just Maria Probatina, Giovanni della Ruota, or simply Deus dedit, God has given. But that wasn't faith. It was erasure. A baptism meant the church now owned the soul. Hospitals could claim donations for every new Christian saved. Florence's ledgers show nobles sponsoring baptisms in exchange for indulgences. Each infant became a ticket to paradise for someone else. Some nurses joked that these children were born twice, once in sin, once in the ledger. Yet their second birth was a death sentence. With no family to protect them, foundlings were shipped to wet nurses in the countryside, many never seen again. By the 14th century, foundling baptism had become less about grace and more about bookkeeping. Imagine an altar surrounded by wailing newborns, the air thick with incense and fear. To the clerks, it wasn't tragedy. It was a good quarter's work. Where there are babies, there's business. Medieval hospitals hired armies of wet nurses to feed their endless supply of foundlings. Rural women desperate for cash signed contracts promising to nurse 1 or 2 infants, sometimes 5. They were paid by the head, and paid extra if the baby lived long enough to be weaned. Survival rates hovered around 10%. The rest died quietly in country cribs while the church still collected funds for their care. Florence alone employed over 400 nurses by the 1500s, each juggling too many mouths and too little milk. Some substituted animal milk. Others simply starved their charges to save time. Records from Bologna show infants returned to hospitals half the size they'd been sent out, their skin stretched over bone like parchment. The system was self-justifying. Every dead child meant another space in the wheel, another contract, another payment. Charity became a supply chain. Modern economists might call it outsourcing. Back then, it was God's will. But the women who turned the wheels knew the truth. They weren't saving souls. They were feeding an industry. Medieval charity wasn't blind. It had balance sheets. In Siena, the Santa Maria della Scala Hospital published public ledgers listing every donation and every expense: candles, wine, burial linen, wet nurse wages. Each infant had a price. The city praised itself for piety, yet budget lines reveal shocking cynicism. Foundlings who died within weeks were cheaper. Hospitals reused their cradles and even their names for the next arrival. Priests called it economy in service of mercy. Others called it corruption. But no one could stop it. Foundling care had become an essential urban business. Merchants left bequests not out of compassion, but reputation. The more babies rescued under your patronage, the better your afterlife looked. Meanwhile, city treasurers audited the dead like livestock. Florence's Spedal reports from 1490 note a surplus of souls, a chilling phrase meaning more baptisms than burials recorded, perfect for attracting donors. The foundling wheel had become what every medieval city loved most: a profitable sin. Infant mortality was the system's open secret. In Paris's Hôpital des Enfants Trouvés, as many as 19 of 20 newborns perished before their second birthday. Infection, malnutrition, neglect, all catalogued neatly in ledgers that read like morgues. Yet the church rarely investigated. Priests preferred to record baptisms, not burials. Some hospitals quietly sold the bodies to medical schools or apothecaries for dissection or alchemy. Others buried dozens together in mass graves behind the walls. Visitors described the stench of milk gone sour mixed with decay, a smell that haunted entire neighborhoods. And yet the wheels kept turning. Cities argued that even a brief baptized life was better than damnation. "They die pure," wrote one Florentine friar, "and so increase the glory of God." Translation: fewer pagans, more angels, better PR. Imagine mothers lighting candles for babies who'd already been thrown to the rats. That's not mercy, that's marketing. Where there's a market, there's fraud. By the 17th century, officials discovered that some foundling hospitals were running black market adoptions. Illegitimate children of nobles, inconvenient evidence of lust, were quietly placed in the wheels, then discreetly reclaimed through bribed intermediaries and adopted by wealthy patrons. Others vanished entirely. In Naples, records show infants listed as dead, who later appeared in convent orphanages under new names. Investigators found wet nurses selling babies to barren couples or even to traveling performers who used them as props for begging. It was human trafficking wrapped in holy silk. The church tried to regulate, issuing decrees limiting redeemed children per year. But demand always outran morality. Some mothers returned years later clutching their half-token, only to be told their child had died, even as that same child served wine in a noble household. A wheel built for compassion had become a factory for secrets. Cities eventually realized the chaos. Paris, Florence, Milan, all created supervisors of foundlings, bureaucrats tasked with auditing mercy. They tracked births, deaths, nurse payments, even burial costs. The irony: the more they recorded, the less they helped. Officials scolded poor mothers for abandoning infants, then fined them if caught trying to reclaim one. Inspectors ordered that no mother could see who took her baby, to preserve anonymity. In reality, it protected institutions, not women. In 1607, the French Parliament investigated reports of nurses drowning newborns rather than carrying them to town. The church called it blasphemy. The city called it cost-saving. Bureaucracy loves order. Compassion loves mess. The foundling wheel had no room for either. By the 17th century, cities were literally building walls of mercy, monuments that hid horror behind polished stone. To keep the donations flowing, hospitals turned death into spectacle. They displayed healthy survivors, often the only ones, during festivals, dressed in white robes and paraded through cathedrals as living proof of divine grace. Wealthy patrons showered them with coins. Clerics preached that every coin saved another child. It was theater, pure and simple. One Florence record describes priests manipulating the wheel publicly to show the ease of mercy, like a charity demo. Behind the curtain, hundreds of babies died weekly. But the illusion worked. Pilgrims left money, painters immortalized cherubic foundlings on frescoes, and the church bells rang for souls who had no names. In modern terms, it was medieval fundraising with a body count. The faithful saw miracles, the administrators saw returns on investment. The children? They never saw daylight again. A few lived long enough to reach adulthood. The Miracoli. They were branded for life. Their surnames, Della Scala, Della Ruota, Esposito, Abbandonato, literally meant of the wheel or exposed. Society treated them like living reminders of sin. Many became servants, prostitutes, or soldiers. In Florence, records show a house of the exposed, where older foundlings were trained in weaving and embroidery, cheap labor masked as moral reform. Some became wet nurses themselves, feeding new generations of the unwanted. One survivor wrote, "I was born twice, once of flesh, again of charity. I prefer the first." Survival didn't mean freedom. It meant inheriting the system that nearly killed them. And yet, centuries later, historians still call the foundling wheel a symbol of compassion. It was never compassion. It was containment. By the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers started asking dangerous questions. If these institutions were so merciful, why did they reek of death? In Paris, the philosopher Condorcet accused the Church of turning pity into population control. Italian reformers like Cesare Beccaria called it the organized neglect of innocence. Statistics backed them. Nearly half of all abandoned infants came from servants impregnated by priests or nobles. The wheels weren't saving poor women. They were protecting powerful men. The church doubled down, claiming that anonymous charity prevented infanticide. But as one Milanese doctor dryly noted, it has merely moved the grave indoors. By the late 1700s, European cities were forced to confront the truth. The wheel didn't stop killing. It just mechanized. By the dawn of the 19th century, the foundling wheel's reputation had curdled from miracle to menace. Enlightened reformers denounced it as a machine for death. In 1783, Paris authorities quietly removed the last working wheel from the Hôpital des Enfants Trouvés, after inspectors discovered rats nesting where infants once lay. Vienna banned its use in 1784. Florence followed in 1875. Yet the idea refused to die. Even as cities modernized, the church fought to preserve safe surrender, a tradition dressed as compassion, but built on centuries of silence. By then, the numbers were staggering. Over 2 million infants passed through foundling institutions across Europe, most into graves. The final reports read like epitaphs: received in health, dead in 4 days, cause, cold and hunger. Bureaucratic poetry for bureaucratic murder. When the last wheel was sealed, the priests called it a victory of modern reason. But the wheels never truly stopped turning. They merely changed shape into orphanages, adoption agencies, foster systems still haunted by the same question. When does mercy become abandonment, wheel of mercy? It began as a door between sin and salvation, a place where desperation could hide its face and still hope for grace. But mercy in medieval Europe was never free. It had to be weighed, priced, and sold like everything else. The foundling wheel wasn't just a hole in a wall. It was a mirror reflecting the machinery of faith and fear, a system built to turn heartbreak into holy profit. Imagine it one last time. The mother in the alley, the lantern light flickering on wet cobblestones. She presses her cheek to the wooden rim, whispers a name she'll never speak again, and turns the handle. Creak. The wheel moves. Her baby disappears to the dark, swallowed by the mouth of mercy. She hears a bell ring inside, the signal for the nuns. For her, that sound means forgiveness. For the child, it means beginning the slow process of dying on someone else's schedule. Every rotation of that wheel was a moral transaction, guilt traded for salvation, suffering converted into paperwork. In a society obsessed with purity, the foundling box offered the illusion of clean hands. No blood in the streets, no corpses in rivers, just quiet streets and the comforting sound of charity creaking through wood and iron. Out of sight, out of sin. That was medieval Europe's favorite miracle. But the truth rotted underneath the incense. Every foundling baptized in a marble basin meant one more unpaid nurse, one more anonymous grave, one more mother condemned to lifelong silence. The church preached compassion while counting corpses. City officials balanced budgets on the bones of babies, and everyone told themselves they were saving souls, because it was easier than admitting they'd built a machine that ate children. Modern historians can still trace the fingerprints of that machine. In dusty archives, there are ledgers that read like lullabies written by accountants. Child received, child baptized, child deceased. The handwriting is elegant, the ink faded, the cruelty absolute. Even the language softened the horror. foundling, innocent, angel. Euphemisms polished to hide the stench of mass death. Here's the irony. The foundling wheel outlived the Middle Ages. Versions of it still exist today. Baby hatches, safe haven boxes, anonymous surrender portals. Stainless steel replaces splintered oak, but the logic remains the same. Society still tells women, "We will forgive you if you disappear quietly." We still prefer mechanical mercy over confronting the reasons people need it in the first place: poverty, shame, power, fear. So when you look at those museum displays, the tiny shoes, the half-tokens, the ledgers with names written in red, remember that they're not just relics, they're receipts, evidence of a trade that turned love into inventory, evidence that civilization has always found ways to make compassion profitable. The wheel that ate babies didn't just vanish, it evolved. It spins every time a system decides that caring for the desperate is too expensive, too inconvenient, or too impure. It spins when institutions hide cruelty behind piety, when the suffering of the powerless becomes someone else's moral credit. And it spins quietly, because that's how it's always worked. We began this story with a question. What happens when mercy becomes an industry? The answer is written in the bones of millions of forgotten children who never had names, never had graves, and never had a choice. So next time someone calls the Middle Ages an age of faith, remember the wheels turning in the night, oiled with tears, powered by desperation, feeding the Church's idea of mercy. Which leaves us with one last question. If the wheel returned tomorrow, how many would turn it? If this story shocked you, share it. Because history's darkest inventions only survive when we forget them. Comment your thoughts below. Would you call the foundling wheel mercy or murder? And don't forget to subscribe for more tales that remind us every miracle in history had a price, and it was usually paid in blood.